Thorn was mending the hole in his roof. Again. The rain came down in a thin, miserable drizzle, the kind that didn't wash the world clean, but just made the mud stickier. It was the smell of his life. Rain on dust. He knew the rules of this forgotten town, huddled in the shadow of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Rule 1. Mind your own business. The walls of your hovel were the walls of your world. Rule 2. Pay your debts to Lord Critch. His ledger was a more fearsome god than any prayed to in the crumbling chapel. And especially Rule 3. The oldest and deepest rule of all. Never, ever help an orc. They were monsters. The wild things from the mountains. Broken remnants of a lost war. But when he climbed down his rickety ladder, his hands raw and his stomach a hollow ache, he found her collapsed at the edge of his sorry patch of land. An orc. A massive female, lying face down in the mud. Her green skin unnaturally pale. A small child was curled against her back, shivering but silent. She was desperate, starving, maybe dying. He broke the most important rule of all, and that choice changed everything. For a long moment, Wieland just stood there, the cold rain plastering his thin shirt to his bony frame. The rules screamed in his head. Go inside, lock the door, pretend you saw nothing. Lord Critch's threats about his overdue debt echoed in that chorus of fear. Helping an orc was a crime, a debt worse than any coin he owed. It was a debt of blood, and the whole town would come to collect. He looked at the orc, at the rise and fall of her broad back, so faint he could barely see it. He looked at the child, a little bundle of rags and matted black hair. Its tiny hand was clenched in the leather of the woman's tunic. They were not a monster. They were a mother and her child. His poverty felt like a constant, seeping dampness, a mold growing on his very soul. But this sight, it was a different kind of chill. It was the ice of true despair. He couldn't do it. He couldn't walk away. His fatal strength, his wife used to call it. His inability to ignore the suffering of a stray dog, a fallen bird, or, it seemed, a dying orc. He walked forward, his worn boots squelching in the mud. The sound was loud in the silence, too loud. He knelt. "Hey," he whispered. A useless word. The orc female didn't move. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitated, then touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold, clammy, but her muscle was dense, hard as ancient wood even in this state. He gave her a gentle shake. A low groan rumbled from her chest, a sound like stones grinding together. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and pain. A deep cut ran along her jawline, crusted with black blood. Her eyes, the color of amber, fixed on him. They weren't filled with hate, as the stories always claimed. They were filled with a weary, desperate fire and a fierce animal protectiveness. Her gaze flickered to the child on her back, then back to him, a challenge, a plea. He saw the tusk, a single, sharp point of ivory curling up past her lip. He saw the strength in her jaw. He knew she could break him in half with one hand, and yet she was the one who was broken. I can help, Wieland said, his voice barely a croak. The words felt foreign and dangerous on his tongue. Shelter, from the rain. The orc, Kaza, though he didn't know her name then, stared at him. She was processing his words through a haze of starvation and pain. Trust was a fragile seed, and the ground of her experience was barren rock. But the rain was relentless, and her child made a small whimpering sound. That sound decided it. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Getting her inside was a nightmare. She was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. He half dragged, half supported her, his own weak frame screaming in protest. Every step was a monumental effort. They stumbled through the doorway of his hovel, a single room that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. He eased her down onto the packed dirt floor near the meager fire pit. The warmth from the few glowing embers seemed to make her shiver more violently. The child, a small boy with wide, terrified eyes and the same green tint to his skin, scrambled off her back and huddled against her, his gaze locked on Valen. A tiny cornered animal. Valen's larder was a joke. A half loaf of stale bread, a shriveled onion, and a small sack of oats that was more dust than grain. It was barely enough for him for 2 days. He looked at the bread. He looked at the orcs. Hunger was a constant, dull ache in his own belly. But their hunger was a sharp, killing thing. He took the bread. He also took the small wooden bowl and filled it with water from his rain barrel. He knelt before them again, holding out the offerings. The mother, Kaza, watched his every move. Her amber eyes followed the bread, the desperation in them so raw it was a physical force. She didn't move to take it. Honor, perhaps, or fear of poison. Velen understood. He broke off a piece of the bread, the crust crackling loudly in the quiet room, and ate it himself. He chewed slowly, then swallowed. He took a sip of the water. He held the rest out again. This time, she reached for it. Her hand was huge, her fingers thick, but her touch was surprisingly gentle as she took the loaf. She didn't devour it. She broke off a small piece and gave it to her son. The boy snatched it and crammed it into his mouth, eating with a ferocity that made Vilen's heart ache. Only after her son had eaten his piece did Kaza take a small bite for herself. They shared the meager meal in silence, a broken human and a broken orc, huddled around a dying fire in a collapsing shack. They were both outcasts. He noticed the wound on her arm then. A nasty gash wrapped in a dirty rag that was soaked through with blood. It looked infected. "That needs cleaning," he said, pointing. She looked down at it, then back at him, her expression guarded. "I have some moss poultice. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." He got up and retrieved a small clay pot from a shelf. The scent of herbs and damp earth filled the air. He knelt beside her again. He expected her to refuse, to recoil. Instead, she watched him for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, extended her wounded arm. It was an act of profound trust, a surrender. He unwrapped the filthy rag. The flesh beneath was swollen and red, the cut deep. He worked carefully, cleaning the wound with the clean cloth and precious water, then applying the cool green paste. Her muscles were tense beneath his touch, but she didn't flinch. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. He wrapped the arm with a strip of clean linen, one of the few valuable things he owned. When he was done, she pulled her arm back slowly. She looked at the clean bandage. Then she looked at him. She said nothing, but her eyes, for the first time, held something other than pain or suspicion. It was a flicker of understanding, a tiny spark in the vast darkness. Velen sat back on his heels, suddenly exhausted. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him. He had brought a monster into his home. He had broken the oldest rule. The debt he owed to Lord Critch was a hangman's noose. This new debt, this crime, was a guillotine. He looked at the rusty key that hung on a leather cord around his neck. It was his father's key to a house and a life long lost to debt. It was worthless, but it was a reminder of a home. Now he had risked his own hovel, the last shelter he had in the world. For what? For a feeling. For the inability to watch a mother and child die in the mud. He didn't know if it was courage or foolishness. The orc child, having finished his bread, had fallen asleep, his head pillowed on his mother's thigh. Kaza's own eyes were heavy. She fought it, her head nodding, her body slumping, but exhaustion was a tide she couldn't fight. Finally, her eyes drifted shut. Her breathing evened out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep. Velen watched them. The firelight softened the harsh lines of her face, made her look less like a warrior and more like any tired mother. In the dim light, Her green skin seemed to glow with a life of its own. He added his last few sticks to the fire, hoping to keep the chill at bay for a few more hours. He sat on his own thin cot, the single piece of furniture in the room, and stared at the sleeping giants who had just taken over his life. The choice was made. The consequences were yet to come. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Villain's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The next morning, the danger felt immediate and suffocating. Villain awoke with a start, the thin grey light of dawn filtering through the cracks in his walls. For a blissful second, he forgot. Then he saw her. Kaza was awake, sitting silently by the dead embers of the fire. She was watching him. Her amber eyes were clear, the haze of pain and exhaustion replaced by a sharp, unnerving intelligence. The child was still asleep beside her. The silence stretched. It was a different kind of silence than the night before. This was not the quiet of shared exhaustion. This was the quiet of assessment. She was a warrior, and she was sizing him up. He felt small and fragile under her gaze. He scrambled out of his cot, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Good morning," he managed, his voice raspy. She gave a curt nod. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "You fed us. You tended my wound. Why?" The question was a spear point aimed at his heart. He had no grand answer. "You were hurt. Your child was cold." "I am Orc," she stated, as if that explained everything, as if it were a full and complete argument against his actions. "I know," Villain said simply. "I also have eyes." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed her face. She looked at her bandaged arm, then back at him. "My name is Kaza. My son is Grok." Villain. The introductions hung in the air, a fragile bridge built between two worlds. The domestic struggle began almost immediately. Villain had nothing left to offer them for breakfast. The oat sack was empty. His stomach twisted with the familiar pangs of hunger, now sharpened by the responsibility for 2 more mouths. He prepared to go out, to forage for roots or mushrooms, a meager and often fruitless task. "Stay inside. Don't make a sound. If anyone sees you." He trailed off. The threat was self-evident. Kaza watched him, her expression unreadable. As he reached for the door, she stood. The movement was fluid and powerful, a predator uncoiling. She was immense in the small room, her head nearly brushing the low ceiling. "I will not be a burden," she rumbled. "I will provide." "No," Villain said, a new and unfamiliar authority in his voice. "You will get us all killed. You don't understand. These people, they are afraid, and fear makes them cruel." Her jaw tightened. He could see the warrior's pride warring with the refugees' desperation. She was used to taking what she needed, to solving problems with strength. This problem, this web of prejudice and debt, was something she couldn't punch. "The roof," she said, pointing upward at the shoddy patch he'd made. "It will not hold against a strong wind. I can fix it, properly." Villain hesitated. The thought of her on his roof, a giant green beacon for the entire village to see, was terrifying. But she was right. His patch was temporary at best, and he saw the need in her eyes, the need to contribute, to reclaim some shred of her honor. "Only at night," he conceded, "and you must be silent." That night, under the sliver of a moon, Kaza worked. She moved with a surprising stealth for a creature of her size. She used her raw strength to lift and reset beams he could barely budge, securing them in place with a skill that spoke of a practical, hard-won knowledge. She wove new thatch with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She was not just a warrior, she was a survivor. While she worked, Villain sat inside with Grok. The boy was wary, but no longer terrified. Velan had carved a small, rough bird out of a piece of firewood for him. Grok held it tightly, his wide eyes following Velan's every move. They didn't speak the same language, but the boy seemed to understand the quiet kindness. The ache of Velan's own lost family, a wife and daughter taken by fever years ago, resonated in the small hovel. This strange temporary arrangement was filling a void he hadn't realized was so vast. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm developed. During the day, they hid. Velan would go out to forage or beg for scraps of work in the village, his ears burning with the whispers that had already started. He was buying more food than usual. He looked more tired. People were suspicious. At night, Kaza would work on the hovel. She shored up a crumbling wall with stones pulled from the earth. She dug a new, deeper drainage ditch to keep the water from pooling at the foundation. She was, piece by piece, turning his ruin into a fortress. The bond between them deepened, not through words, but through shared tasks and silent understanding. He would bring back a handful of bitter roots, and she would know a way to boil them to remove the worst of the taste. He would tend to her wound, which was slowly healing, and she would allow the touch without flinching. It was a heartwood bond, he thought, like two different trees growing so close their roots intertwine, becoming inseparable beneath the surface. They were becoming a family, a strange, impossible family, built on a foundation of desperation and choice. The conflict, when it came, arrived on heavy boots and smelling of ink and arrogance. Lord Howell Critch. He didn't knock. The door of the hovel flew open, banging against the wall. Velan, who had been sharing a thin root stew with Kaza and Grok, jumped to his feet. Kaza had moved with lightning speed, pulling Grok behind her and melting into the darkest corner of the room, becoming one with the shadows. Lord Critch filled the doorway. He was a man made of soft flesh and hard angles, his expensive clothes a stark contrast to the poverty around him. Two burly guards flanked him. His eyes, small and piggy, scanned the single room with disdain. "Thorn," Critch said, his voice slick with false congeniality. "The ledger tells me you are overdue, again." "My lord," Velan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "The work has been scarce. The rains—" "Excuses are not coin," Critch sneered, stepping inside. His gaze swept the room again, and this time it snagged on the details. "The roof! It seems you've had some work done. And that wall. Solid. Surprising for a man of your limited means." Velan's blood ran cold. "I have been diligent." Critch took another step, his polished boot stopping inches from a large, muddy footprint near the wall. A footprint far too large to be Velan's. Critch's eyes narrowed. He sniffed the air. "And you're eating better. I smell stew. Not just boiled grass today, eh?" "A lucky find in the woods, my lord." Critch smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. He didn't believe a word. He was a predator who had scented a weakness, a secret. Secrets were leverage. "The debt, Thorn, 20 silver pieces by the new moon, or I will have this improved hovel torn down for firewood, and you will be sent to the mines." The threat was absolute. 20 silver pieces was an impossible sum, a lifetime of debt. Velan could feel Kaza's presence in the corner, a coiled spring of violent potential. He could feel her rage, her instinct to protect this fragile sanctuary. He had to keep her hidden. He had to keep her calm. "I will have it, my lord," Velan lied, bowing his head in a show of subservience he despised. Critch chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "I'm sure you will." He glanced one last time at the shadows in the corner, a knowing glint in his eye. He hadn't seen her, not clearly, but he knew something was wrong. "See that you do." He turned and left, his guards following him out. The open doorway let in the cold afternoon light, making the hovel feel dark and small again. The moment he was gone, Kaza stepped out of the shadows. Her face was a thundercloud. "That man, he is a parasite." He is the law, Vilin said wearily, sinking onto his cot. The weight of the 20 silver debt settled on him, crushing the air from his lungs. It was over. There was no way to pay it. They would be homeless. He would be a slave in the mines. And Kaza and Grok, they would be hunted. I have fought warlords more fearsome than him, Kaza growled, pacing the small space. You can't fight a ledger, Kaza, Vilin said, his voice hollow. You can't kill a debt with a blade. She stopped pacing and looked at him. She saw the utter despair on his face. She saw the wall of this human world, a wall of numbers and laws that was more impassable than any fortress of stone. He had shown her kindness. He had offered her sanctuary, and now his world was ending because of it. She knelt in front of him, her huge form eclipsing the meager light. She put a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was surprisingly gentle. You stood for me, she said, her voice low. You did not turn us away. My honor demands I stand for you. There is nothing to be done, he whispered, staring at the dirt floor. There is always something to be done, she insisted. Her eyes burned with an ancient fire. We are a family, Vilin, a clan of two, and a clan does not fall while one of its members can still fight. He looked up at her then, at this fierce, impossible creature who spoke of honor and family as if they were weapons. And for the first time since Lord Critch had walked in, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of his heart. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, but it was no longer alone. It was joined by her strength, her resolve. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below, would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Howell Critch wasn't finished yet. Lord Critch was a man who thrived on the certainty of his ledgers. The numbers told him who was weak, who was desperate, and who could be squeezed. Violin Thorn was a known quantity, a broken man, barely surviving. But the repaired hovel, the scent of real food, the too large footprint, these were anomalies. They didn't add up, and Lord Critch hated things that didn't add up. His suspicion festered, turning into a greasy certainty. Thorn had help that required strength, help that had to be hidden. And in this part of the world, hidden strength usually came in one form: green skin, tusks. The bounty offered by the warlord Thrathrak Skull Render for a female orc deserter was 50 silver pieces, far more than Vilin's pathetic debt. Critch sent a messenger, a grubby youth paid in copper pennies, and fear speeding toward the warlord's temporary encampment in the foothills. The message was simple. The deserter was here. The location was precise. The reward was expected. Greed was a far more powerful motivator for Critch than any sense of civic duty. He was selling out Vilin, Kaza, and the child not for safety, but for profit. He was trading their lives for a number in his book. 2 days later, the warlord arrived. Thrathrak Skull Render did not enter the village quietly. He came with a dozen mounted orc warriors, their faces painted with white skulls, their armor a patchwork of iron and bone. They rode snarling wargs, massive wolf-like beasts, whose growls vibrated in the very cobblestones of the town square. The villagers scurried into their homes, barring their doors. The festive banners for the upcoming harvest festival drooped in the sudden, terrified silence. Thrathrak was even larger than Kaza, his skin a mottled, sickly grey. A heavy, chipped axe was strapped to his back, and a necklace of teeth, human, orc, and other things, hung around his thick neck. He dismounted in front of Lord Critch's residence, his heavy boots thudding with grim purpose. "The landlord," he grunted, his voice like a rock slide. Critch scurried out, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. "Warlord Thrathrak. An honor, a distinct honor." "Honor is for fools," Thrathrak growled, spitting on the ground. "The female, where is she?" In the hovel of a debtor named Villain Thorn, at the edge of the village, a pathetic shack. You can't miss it. Critch pointed a trembling finger. The bounty? You will have your coin when I have her head, Thrathrak snarled. He turned to his warriors. Surround the shack. No one gets out. I will deal with the traitor myself. Inside the hovel, the world had shrunk to the sound of their own breathing. They had heard the commotion, the howls of the wargs, the screams of the villagers. Kazan knew. Her face was a stone mask, but her eyes were burning coals. She held Grog tightly, whispering to him in the guttural Orcish tongue, words of comfort and courage. He has found me, she said to Villain. It was not a question. We can run, Villain said, his mind racing. Out the back, into the woods. No, Kaza said, her voice flat and final. His warriors will be everywhere. They will hunt us down. Running is a slow death. A warrior's death is swift. She looked at him, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. You must tell them I forced you, that I held you captive. They might spare you. No, Villain said, the word coming out with a strength that surprised him. He looked at Kaza, at the magnificent, terrified, honorable creature who had repaired his home and shared his table. He looked at Grog, who was staring at him with wide, trusting eyes. They were his family now, his clan. A clan does not fall while one of its members can still fight, he said, echoing her own words back to her. A loud bang on the door made them all jump. Traitor Kaza! Thrathrak's voice boomed from outside. Face your judgment. The blood debt must be paid. Kaza took a deep breath. She gently pushed Grog towards Villain. Keep him safe, she whispered. It was an order, a final wish. She turned to face the door, her hands clenched into fists, ready to die fighting. But Villain stepped in front of her. He was a scarecrow of a man standing before a mountain, but he did not waver. Stay here, he commanded. He walked to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. He took one deep, shuddering breath and pulled it open. Thrathrak stood there, a giant silhouette against the grey sky, his lip curled in a sneer as he saw Villain. A human hiding her. The stench of your weakness fills the air. Step aside before I walk through you. She is under my protection, Villain said. The words were quiet, but they carried an iron will he didn't know he possessed. Thrathrak laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Your protection. You are a twig, human. I will snap you without a thought. He raised a massive, gauntleted hand to shove Villain aside. Then you will have to, Villain said, standing his ground. But you will not do it here. Not in my home. He was stalling, buying seconds, though he didn't know for what. If you want to pass judgment, do it in the open, in the village square. Let everyone see your justice. Thrathrak paused. The strange request intrigued him. The idea of a public execution appealed to his sense of theatre and cruelty. He looked past Villain and saw Kaza, her face grim, standing behind him. A public judgment, he mused. Yes, let the humans see what happens to those who shelter traitors. Let them see what happens to deserters. He grabbed the front of Villain's shirt and hauled him out of the hovel. Bring her, he bellowed to his warriors. They were dragged to the village square. The entire population of the town was there, forced from their homes by Thrathrak's warriors. They formed a silent, terrified circle. Lord Critch stood near the warlord, a smug, proprietary look on his face. Kaza was forced to her knees in the center of the square. Grog was still with Villain, his small hand clutching Villain's trousers in a death grip. Kaza of the Bloodrock clan, Thrathrak boomed, pacing before her. You deserted your post. You abandoned your warlord in a time of war. You broke your blood oath. The penalty is death. The war was for your greed, not for our people's honor. Kaza shot back, her voice ringing with defiance. You slaughtered innocents. I would not be a part of it. Honor, Thrathrak spat. Honor is a word for the dying. He drew his massive axe. The crowd gasped. The blade was notched and stained. Your life is forfeit. He raised the axe. The sunlight glinted off the polished edge. Kaza closed her eyes. Grok buried his face in Villain's leg, letting out a choked sob. And then Villain moved. He stepped forward, placing his own thin body between the axe and Kaza. Stop. The single word cut through the tension. Everyone stared. The weak human, the broken debtor, standing up to the skull render. It was suicide. Thrathrak stared down at him, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. You seek death that badly, little man. This isn't justice, Villain said, his voice shaking but clear. He wasn't just speaking to Thrathrak anymore. He was speaking to the crowd, to his neighbors, to the people who had whispered behind his back. You call her a monster? A traitor? I'll tell you what she is. She is a mother who protected her child. She is a survivor who fixed my roof when no one else would help me. She is a warrior with more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire body. He turned to the crowd, his eyes pleading. Look at her. Is this the monster from your stories? Or is she just someone trying to live? Just like the rest of us. We are all afraid. We are all struggling. We are all in debt. He shot a look at Lord Critch, who flinched. This warlord offers you fear. This landlord offers you chains. She offered me help. She showed me kindness. Kindness as a weapon. The words were his only shield. Kindness doesn't fill your belly, Thorn, a man shouted from the crowd. Kindness doesn't pay, Lord Critch. No, Villain agreed, his gaze sweeping back to the crowd. It doesn't, but it's the only thing that makes us human. It's the only thing that separates us from him. He gestured to Thrathrak. Thrathrak roared with fury. Enough talk! He shoved Villain aside. Villain stumbled and fell hard on the cobblestones. Thrathrak stood over Kaza, the axe held high once more. Her life is mine. It was then that Kaza acted, not with violence, but with a different kind of strength. Wait, she cried out. Her voice was strained, but it commanded attention. Slowly, with her one free hand, she reached into a hidden pouch inside her tunic. The crowd watched, mesmerized. Thrathrak paused, curious. What weapon could she possibly have? She pulled out her hand. It was not a weapon. It was a small, heavy leather sack. With a grunt, she untied the drawstring and turned it upside down. Gold. Ancient, heavy, orcish gold coins spilled onto the dusty cobblestones. They shone with a deep, lustrous light, unlike any human currency. There were dozens of them, a fortune. The crowd gasped as one. The silence was absolute, broken only by the clinking of the rolling coins. Kaza looked up, not at Thrathrak, but at Villain, and then at the stunned villagers. This was for a new life for my son, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But this man, he gave me a home when I had nothing. His debt is my debt. She looked directly at Lord Critch, whose eyes were wide with avarice, his jaw hanging open. 20 silver for his debt, she declared, pushing a small pile of the gold forward with her boot. It was worth 100 times that. And another 100 for the town, to repair the chapel, to fill the granary, for a real harvest festival, in exchange for sanctuary, for a place in this community. It was a shocking, brilliant move. She wasn't just buying Villain's freedom. She was trying to buy a future. She was trying to buy her way into the human world. The turning point had come. The weak human had stood up for the strong orc, and the orc had just revealed a hidden value that could change everything. The choice was no longer about fear. It was about gold. It was about hope. The crowd stared at the treasure, then at the warlord, then at the landlord, and for the first time, they began to see things differently. The silence that followed Kaza's offer was a living thing. It was thick with a glint of gold and the weight of a monumental choice. The villagers, who had been a single entity of fear, began to fracture. You could see it in their eyes. The gold was a tangible solution to their intangible problems. It was a new roof. It was food for the winter. It was freedom from Lord Critch's crushing ledgers. It was a hope they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in years. Thrathrak Skull-Render saw the shift, and his face contorted with rage. His power was built on fear and violence, a currency that was suddenly being devalued. "Fools!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "It is Orc gold, cursed. She is a deserter. Her life is forfeit by blood law." But the villagers were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Lord Critch. The landlord was practically drooling, his eyes fixed on the pile of ancient coins. Greed had completely overtaken his senses. He saw his own power, his own wealth, multiplying before his very eyes. It was a blacksmith, a big man named Owen, with arms like tree trunks, who spoke first. His voice was a low growl. "That gold could feed my children all winter." "It could fix the bridge," another woman added, her voice thin but clear. "It's more coin than this town has seen in a generation," someone else whispered. The whispers grew, merging into a low murmur of agreement. The wall of prejudice was cracking, eroded by the sudden flood of possibility. Lord Critch, seeing his opportunity, made his move. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "As the authority in this town," he began, his voice oozing with a false sense of command, "I accept this payment. The debt is cleared. The rest will be put into the town coffers, under my judicious management, of course." He started to stoop down to scoop up the gold. Thrathrak roared and swung his axe, not at Kazar, but at the ground right in front of Critch's feet. Sparks flew as the blade struck the cobblestones. Critch shrieked and scrambled backward, falling on his rump in a most undignified manner. "The female is mine," Thrathrak bellowed, his eyes wild. "Her head is worth more than your pathetic town." But he had lost the crowd, and he knew it. His authority had vanished. He was no longer a terrifying warlord enforcing a blood oath. He was just a bully trying to steal their miracle. Vilain, still on the ground, saw his chance. He scrambled back to his feet and stood beside Kazar again. He looked at the blacksmith, Owen. "Owen, is this the kind of leader you want? One who threatens you for his own gain?" He pointed at Critch, who was still sputtering on the ground. "Or this one, who has kept his boot on your necks for years? Kazar offers a partnership. They offer only chains." Owen the blacksmith looked at Thrathrak's axe. He looked at Lord Critch's pathetic form. Then he looked at Kazar, kneeling but defiant, and at Vilain, the skinny, worthless man who was suddenly the bravest person he'd ever seen. He looked at the gold. He took a slow step forward, hefting the heavy hammer that was always tucked in his belt. "The woman offers a fair deal," Owen said, his voice resonating through the square. He was joined by two farmhands holding pitchforks, then a woman with a cast-iron skillet. More and more villagers stepped forward, no longer a terrified audience, but a united front. They formed a new circle, one that protected Kazar and Vilain, and faced outward at the warlord and the landlord. Thrathrak looked at the sea of determined faces, at the makeshift weapons, at the complete and utter collapse of his power. His warriors, seeing their leader falter and the odds turn against them, began to back away, their wargs whining nervously. They were mercenaries, not zealots. They weren't willing to die for Thrathrak's personal vendetta against a town of angry armed commoners. "This is not over, traitor," Thrathrak snarled at Kazar, his voice venomous. But the threat was empty. He knew he was beaten. He backed away, step by step, his eyes darting around at the hostile crowd. With a final curse, he turned, mounted his warg, and galloped out of the square, his remaining warriors trailing behind him like smoke in the wind. They were gone. The square was silent for a moment, the villagers breathing in the sudden absence of terror. Then all eyes turned to the one enemy that remained, Lord Howell Critch. He tried to stand, to regain some composure. "Now, see here," he blustered. "As I was saying, the town fund—" "Shut up, Critch," Owen the blacksmith said, taking a menacing step forward. Your days of squeezing us dry are over. You can't do this, Critch squealed. I represent the king's law. The king ain't been seen in these parts in 50 years, the woman with the skillet retorted. We make our own law now, and the first law is, no more parasites. The crowd surged forward. They didn't harm him, not physically, but they stripped him of his power. They took his ledgers, the books of debt that had been his weapons for so long. They tore out the pages, one by one, letting the wind carry the fragments away like bitter confetti. They ran him out of town, his fine clothes torn and muddy, his threats and pleas ignored. He was a king with no subjects, a god with no believers. When the chaos subsided, the square was quiet again. The villagers stood around, slightly dazed, looking at Velin, Kaza, and the pile of gold. Kaza was slowly getting to her feet, her legs stiff. Velin helped her up. Grog, who had been hiding behind Velin the whole time, peeked out. Velin looked at the faces of his neighbors. He saw confusion, awe, and a dawning respect. The gold is yours, he said, his voice hoarse, as she promised. Owen the blacksmith walked over and picked up a single gold coin. He looked at it, then at Kaza. Welcome to town, he said gruffly. He then turned to Velin and clapped him on the shoulder, a heavy, friendly blow that nearly sent him sprawling. You did good, Thorn, you did good. The happy ever after didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, like the rebuilding of the town itself. The first piece was the debt. It was gone. The abstract terror that had haunted Velin's every waking moment simply vanished. The weight was so immense, its absence left him feeling dizzy and light for days. The second piece was the house. With a portion of the gold and the help of Owen and other villagers who now saw him as a hero, Velin's hovel was transformed. The roof was retiled properly this time. New sturdy walls were erected. A real wooden floor was laid down and glass was put in the window frames. It became a cottage, small but strong, a real home. Kaza and Grok stayed. There was never any question. Their place was no longer a secret to be hidden in the shadows, but an accepted fact of village life. It wasn't always easy. Prejudice, like a deep-set stain, doesn't wash out overnight. Some villagers still crossed the street to avoid Kaza. Children would sometimes point and whisper. But it was different now. The fear was gone, replaced by a grudging curiosity and, for many, a genuine gratitude. Kaza, for her part, found her place not with a sword, but with her strength. She helped haul the heavy stones needed to repair the old chapel. She single-handedly raised the main beam for the new granary. Her warrior skills translated surprisingly well to construction and labor. People began to see her not as an orc, but as Kaza, the one who could lift anything. Grok, shy at first, slowly started to play with the human children, who were fascinated by his green skin and his quiet strength. They taught him their games. He taught them how to track squirrels in the woods. A new community began to form, one stitched together with the threads of shared struggle and newfound prosperity. The gold was managed by a new town council, with Owen, the blacksmith, at its head. The harvest festival that year was a celebration unlike any the town had ever seen. There was music, dancing, and tables groaning with food. Velin, Kaza, and Grok sat at the head table, a place of honor. One evening, months later, Velin sat on the new porch of his cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Kaza sat beside him, sharpening a small knife, a habit she never lost. Grok was asleep inside, tired out from a day of playing. It's quiet, Kaza said, her voice a low, contented rumble. Yes, Velin agreed. It was a good quiet, the quiet of peace, not of fear. He reached up and touched the rusty key that still hung around his neck. He had never taken it off. It was a key to a past that was gone, a home that was lost. But now, it felt different. Kaza noticed the gesture. That key, she said. What is it for? Nothing anymore, Vilin said, looking at it in his palm. It was for my father's house, before debt took it. I kept it to remember. It is not a key to a house that is gone, Kaza said, her amber eyes soft in the twilight. She reached out and gently closed his fingers over it. It is the key that opened your door to us. It is the key that opened this new future. It is not worthless. It is the most valuable thing you own. Vilin looked from the key to her face. He saw not a monster, not a deserter, not an orc. He saw his family. He saw his home. He realized that all his life, he thought he had nothing. He was wrong. He had a choice, and he had chosen compassion. He had chosen family, and that choice had saved them all. Different didn't mean enemy. It just meant different. And sometimes different was exactly what you needed. And that is how a poor human and a desperate orc warrior proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.